Hey guys, in today's video we are going to answer the question, what is the most realistic place in Star Stable? For this video we're going to focus on the most realistic home stable. So we're not going to look at places like Marley's Farm or like Crescent Moon Village. If you want to see a video about that, just let us know in the comments. So for each of the home stables we're going to look at the realistic aspects and the unrealistic aspects. So why don't we just jump right in. Silverglade Manor is an equestrian center, but it's also a vineyard. So here in the left corner are some pictures of some real vineyards. So you can look at those and see how similar the game looks to real life. So there's a lot of detail in the way the grapevines are sitting on the wooden post, and it just looks very realistic to a real vineyard. Even the gardens at the Silverglade Manor look pretty realistic. These pink flowers look a lot like common flowers you would see. Now taking a look at the arena at the Silverglade Equestrian Center, you can see this wooden bridge. Most arenas don't have any type of bridge leading to them. A lot of times when training a horse to be on trails, they have to train them how to step on wood. So I just feel like it's pretty unrealistic that there's this, wooden bridge that most horses would probably be afraid to walk on leading to your arena. But aside from that, the arena looks, very much like a common riding arena. It's big and circular, and it's got the wooden fence around it. That's pretty typical for an arena. You can even see the detail in the hoof marks in the dirt of the arena. So now these guest houses at the Silverglade Equestrian Center, they are pretty typical guest houses. It would make sense that you would have to have some type of place for your stable manager to stay, or anybody that works at the vineyard. Taking a look at the sale barn, you can see that all the horses have individual stalls, which I feel like is pretty realistic, but the stalls are open. If you look at these pictures, there's a normal type of sale lot or auction where the horses are usually just in like corral panel little pens, and that's pretty common, or also these really fancy barns with stalls. But usually your horses aren't just left in a open stall. They would have to be tied up somehow, or they would wander away. The manor also has very realistic trails. It would make sense that the riders at the Equestrian Center would, practice cross-country and need these trails to jump on. A lot of boarding places and riding stables have at least some type of trails to ride on. Looking at the main stable, you can see that there's some hay out in the open on the right. Most barns usually keep their hay inside, just, so horses don't get distracted by it, and also so that it doesn't get rained on. There's also a hayloft, so the hay should probably go in the hayloft, but that's pretty realistic. Most barns have some type of hayloft or somewhere to store their hay. This barn also has the open stall problem. The horses would probably wander out of those stalls unless they were tied up somehow. So that's another unrealistic feature of the manor. So next we're going to be analyzing Jorvik stables. So you can see it's made out of a yellow brick and some wood. So in this picture here, this barn is made out of similar materials. Again, with Jorvik stables, it has the same open stalls concept, which isn't very realistic unless there's cross ties, which of course there aren't in game. Typically, barns are built using whatever resources are common in a specific area, but brick barns were particularly popular in the mid-19th century. Through some of the quests, we learned that in 1871 an earthquake shook the entire island, which destroyed the original stable, which was built in John Charles' days. The architecture of Jorvik stables supports its history. Next, we're going to look at the large arena in Jorvik stables. In real life, arenas are typically an oval shape or a rectangular shape. This arena in game is rectangular. The fence is called white crossbuck fencing and is common at equestrian facilities. If you look closely at the fence, it looks faded, which would make sense if the area is so old. The only unrealistic feature is that there are a lot of openings, which makes sense in game, but most arenas are fully enclosed. Unlike at Silverglade Equestrian Center, Jorvik Stables has paddocks or turnout pens for the horses, which is very realistic. However, there are also gaps in these fences so the horses could just wander around. Similarly, the pigs and cows are standing in pens where they could just walk and wander freely. There is one other realistic feature at Jorvik stables. Most barns and stables of this size need a tractor. So next we're going to take a look at Steve's farm. The barn is made out of wood, which is a very generic material. And even the design is pretty standard if you look at these pictures. And Steve's barn does have a hayloft like some of the other barns, which is another realistic feature. So overall the barn and the structure are all pretty realistic. To the left of the barn are the turnout pens, and the structure and the fencing is all really realistic. However, it has the same problem where there's no gates, so the horses could just wander around freely. Behind Steve's, you can see that there are lines of hay bales, and there's two different kinds of hay bales. There's the old model and the new model, and they're just kind of being absorbed into the ground. So this is probably going to change, but for now this is very unrealistic. Steve's barn is located near the center of Jorvik, right near Barney's silo and Marley's arena over there. And in real life, typically a lot of your barns are located towards the countryside. There are of course exceptions, but the location of it is pretty realistic to what you might see in real life. And last is the arena, which is very realistic. It's a square shape and has the similar fencing as Jorvik. Now we're going to take a look at Golden Leaf Stables. So the main barn is a lot like all the other barns. It has the open stalls, it's got the hay sitting on the open, it has a hay loft, but it also is unique because it's red wooden. It's a pretty common looking barn. It kind of has a rustic look. The wind vane on top gives it a unique detail that kind of helps make it look rustic. So it also has trails, like the manor. The trails have jumps, which would be useful when you're practicing cross country. You can ride on the beach. It's a popular activity to ride horses on the beach. Another thing about Golden is the whole area is always fall. This, makes sense in game and it gives the area a unique look, but it's also very unrealistic. A place wouldn't be fall 365 days a year. The guest houses are a lot like the manor or Jorvik stables. They add another realistic aspect to the game. In the arena, there are these jumps. They're very realistic. They look like a lot of common jumps, and they also look like they'd be easy to move, which makes sense if you have them sitting in the arena. They're different from the ones that are out in the trails that never get moved. So the sale barn over here also has that open stall concept. The horses would need to be tied up somehow. And lastly, Golden also has a realistic outdoor arena. It's a lot like the manor. It's just a typical circular arena. So next we're going to take a look at South Hoof. This area in the game was updated more recently. The barn here is made out of stone, which is less common, but still a popular choice for barns. So the arena is similar to a lot of the other arenas in the game, with a different type of fencing, which is similar to these pictures here on the right. There's also some corn and crops around South Hoof, which look very realistic. However, the corn in real life is a little bit less spacious than they have in game. A lot of ranches have these grand entrances here, and you can see on South Hoof they have their logo, which is another similar trend. There are a lot of small details that Star Stable added when they updated South Hoof to make it more realistic. There's this storage facility right here. Another feature that they added are these wash stalls, which are not open like some of the barns in Star Stable. There's also a hitching post with water and food, and this realistic chicken coop, as well as these trails. So here we are at Fir Grove Stables. The stables looks a lot like all the other home stable. There's hay out in the open, there's a hay loft, the stalls are open, but the actual structure of the barn is a mix of stone and wood. This is a pretty common look for a barn. It's commonly used for wedding venues and things like that, as well as actual horse stables. The village is also pretty different. It's made mostly of wood. There's this wall around the whole place, and I found a couple walls that do exist that look like this, but most of them are really old, and it's really not common to see them. So it's not very realistic that there's this protection and defense wall around Fir Grove, but I did find a few that exist. The stable also has cross-country trails. The jumps are really realistic, like most of the other places in Star Stable. There's even just simple riding trails that don't have jumps for trail riders and pleasure riders. So now we're going to look at Fort Pinta stables. The Yellowstone barn is a little bit different. It's not exactly that common, but I did find an example of a Yellowstone barn. The barn has a hayloft. It also has the open stall issue. So these horses for sale over here aren't pinned in. They don't have a stall. They're just completely free, so that's really unrealistic. The other horses for sale here, they're untied with the open stall, but at least they have some type of stall. Over here on the right, you can see an example of a horse being tied up in that open stall structure. So the bridge leading to Fort Pinta is unsafe. Imagine riding across this bridge and your horse got nervous for some reason. He could just slide right off. Fort Pinta also has the cross-country trails. This first jump on the left here is a little bit strange. I've never seen anything like it, but these second and third jumps look pretty normal, typical cross-country jumps. So the diving board here is also a kind of unrealistic feature. I don't think it would be very safe to take your horse off a diving board into water, especially this kind of shallow water. Swimming with your horse, though, that is pretty realistic and pretty cool. And Fort Pinta is also a really touristic location, and that kind of makes sense with James being, in charge of kind of the Fort Pinta area. Now we're going to take a look at New Hillcrest stables. So the barn is made of a combination of stone and wood, which is realistic. You can see these barns in the picture look similar. This barn has the same problem with the open stalls like all the others, but one of the differences is that there are round hay bales when most of the other barns around Star Stable have square bales. So the turnout pen has the same fencing as Jorvik with the crossbuck fencing, which we already stated is realistic. The paddock is also open so the horses could wander freely, which is another unrealistic feature. One special thing about this paddock is it's right up close to the barn. One thing I noticed was this stack of firewood behind the barn, which is cut just like it would be in real life with some triangle and some round pieces. It's really realistic. As you mentioned previously, people like to ride on the beach. It's something that a lot of people want to do, and Jorvik is really lucky to have a lot of beaches. Next, we're going to take a look at Vail Dale stables, and the barn is composed of white brick, wood, and some stone, so it's kind of hard to match perfectly, but all three of these barns here have a little bit in common. There are still the open stalls in the stable. That's something that you can kind of see as a trend all across, except for the most recent updated places. One thing I noticed while recording is that Herman can magically be in two places at once. Here he is in Vail Dale, and at the same time, he's at Jorvik stables. Vail Dale also has living quarters for the workers, which is another realistic feature. And the entire town kind of has the same appearance, which works for the game. However, in real life, barns in the cities around them don't typically have the same features. Now, another thing I noticed is it's a long run to the arena. Imagine how annoying that would be if you have to travel this far in real life to get to the arena. But in the game, the arena is based around some of the Soul Rider quests. So again, it's more understandable how it's kind of hidden up here. And the arena itself is really realistic. It has the same fencing as we saw at South Hoof, and it's the same oval shape. So it's a really realistic arena, and they did update some of these trees, and I noticed that they were kind of really unique here. There are also some cattle at Vail Dale, which is another realistic feature. As we stated before, there are often cattle and horses together. And there are some trails and cross-country courses, as we saw with the Manor and Fir Grove. So here we are in Mistfall at Dundle Stables. The barn is a wooden structure. It looks pretty realistic. It has an actual closed turnout over there on the right. There's even a wind vane on top of the barn. The only thing really unrealistic is that there's the hay left out in the open that lady is standing on. There's even a hitching post. Now looking at this arena, there's these nice realistic jumps on the outside. They look like they would be typical jumps that you would move into the arena to jump. But if you actually go into the arena, there are these immobile jumps over here. I feel like it's a little unrealistic to have immobile jumps in the arena because oftentimes you're going to take the jumps out at some point. So I feel like those mobile jumps that are on the outside of the arena should be used on the inside. But other than that, this outdoor arena is pretty realistic. It looks a lot like the other arenas in the game. Mistfall has a bunch of trails for riding. This is pretty realistic. It makes the setting of the barn make sense. Most barns would be located with some forestry around them. This place also has the open sale pins. So they have a bunch of horses for sale over here. There's even this ranger station round pin. It's probably the most realistic in the game. It actually closes. There's food and water for the Mustangs. And there's even the ranger station, which is another realistic thing. A lot of outdoor, areas like this with all these trails would have some type of ranger station around them. This bonfire is realistically styled, and the fire looks amazing, but it's also unattended, and you would never leave a flame this large unattended. Back at the actual stable, there's this realistic saddle stand. There's a hitching post. It's all pretty realistic other than that giant pile of hay bales in the back. It's not very common to leave such a big stack of, square bells with all the tie wrap and stuff still on them because the horses could get into them. So last, we're going to take a look at Moorland stables. So Moorland and the surrounding areas were all updated more recently. So the barn structure is really common. It's like many of the other barns. It's very similar to Vail Dale. So if we take a look around the stables, this kind of design here is kind of an uncommon but more popular design for stables with a more open concept. So if you take a look at all these shops, they've all been updated and they have much more realistic design than many of the other places across Jorvik. So the pole bending course is designed very realistically. There are 6 poles and you follow the right pattern. The only unrealistic feature about this is that it's not in an arena. You can look at Moorland, they've got 2 other arenas and pole bending is kind of off to the side. Most pole bending is done in some type of arena. So the arena does have a realistic design. The fencing is realistic, we see it across Jorvik, but the only thing, it continues to have the open spaces. The trails surrounding the area have all been updated as well, and they continue to have a more realistic look, which is kind of a trend as we look at the more recently updated things. We see that it's more realistic than some of the older locations across Jorvik. The main arena is very realistic as well. It looks very similar to the Manor Arena. So overall, I feel like the stables that were added more recently or updated more recently are the most realistic. For example, South Hoof and Dundle, those stables had a lot of realistic features, but they've been updated and added more recently. A lot of the common bad things, like the open stalls, where the horses are for sale, that's the same throughout all of Jorvik, and that makes sense because that's kind of how the game works. It's a game, it's never going to be perfectly realistic, but I do feel like overall Star Stable is getting more realistic. When they updated Moorland, it got more realistic, the shops look more realistic, and even the new jumping saddles that they added, those are more realistic. So I feel like, as a whole, Star Stable is getting a little bit more realistic. Thanks for watching the video. Let us know what you think in the comments.